Welcome back to the Beat Motel podcast. It's Sam and me, Andrew, again. And we've been talking about falling out of love. We had an idea for a podcast episode. What bands did you used to really love? I mean, like obsess about, listen to, probably too much, but that you now haven't listened to for a very long time. So, Sam, this was your idea. Do you mean bands that you can't bear to listen to now, or?
Well, it was sort of like that but I've had this sort of criticism going on in my head with a lot of things, and I'm actually going to hijack this podcast and do something related but slightly different because it got me thinking. On my commute, I was listening to Rancid, and you can play the first Rancid song if you want.
Should I go for that now?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I'm not going to tell you what my songs are. I'm going to try and make you guess.
Sure.
Anyway, here's Sam's Rancid song. I've never been a huge fan of Rancid, but I've always absolutely fucking loved that bass playing. It's bonkers.
Yeah, and the tone and the centrality they give it to the music. I think actually production wise, they're one of my favorite bands because the guitars are like quite thin in a way, but they have a nice sort of attack to them. Whereas the bass has all like the melody. Actually, the mid in the bass is fantastic. But actually, I was listening to that. That's from their 2000 album, self-titled album, and I love that album. And then I was listening to their latest thing, which was 2017, and it just sounded like shit. And I was thinking about this theme that we were
In
doing.
what
And it
way?
was,
Can you objectively describe it?
I don't know, like they had gone on so long doing the same sort of thing. They had gone from being sort of pretty cool, something pretty cool, to being something like it's a bit like Friends. By the end, they were just parodies of the characters that they wanted to be. So they started out with like a 3D-ness, and then they end with this like two-dimensionality to it. It's all like we are street kids and we're not coming back, and just like how many layers of cliches can you ram into one song sort of aspect, and not just cliches of what is called street punk, but cliches that they themselves sort of helped put in place and create. But I was thinking about this, like to me, it's saying Rancid aren't as good as they were, their albums aren't as good as they were, to me is a bit like cherry picking. So I've actually written a bit of an essay that I'm gonna read you,
Oh,
and
go for it.
this is my taking over this thing.
Hmm.
So the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, and I apologize for a pronunciation of this name, writes in his book Psychopolitics that we are living, and this is a quote, we are living in a particular phase of history. Freedom itself is bringing forth compulsion and constraint. The freedom of can generates even more coercion than the disciplinarian should, which issues commandments and prohibitions. Should has a limit, can has none. Thus, the compulsion entailed by can is unlimited. And so we find ourselves in a paradoxical situation. Technically, freedom means the opposite of coercion and compulsion. Being free means being free from constraint, but now freedom is producing coercion. Psychic maladies such as depression and burnout express a profound crisis of freedom. They represent pathological signs that freedom is now switching over into the manifold forms of compulsion. End quote. Between 1999 and 2022, the band, released, only counting albums, 22 albums,
God.
7 solo, 15 collaborative, and another collaborative album. King Gizzard and the Electric Wizard have released 23 albums and 14 live albums since 2010. On a slightly more subdued front, Death Grips released 7 albums in 6 years. but no albums for the last 5. And similarly, between 2012 and 2022, the Melvins released only 11 albums. And I'm sure there are other examples, but my argument is that the music on these albums is not shit. I don't know, frankly. I haven't listened to most of it, and who can? Who can trawl through so much and really come to terms with it? Some of the body stuff is great, and a friend assures me that some of the Electric Wizard stuff is genius. Death Grips were at the forefront of the current noise hip hop scene, and I certainly loved the first mixtape. And the Melvins, they do what they do. But rather to build on Byung-Chul Han's analysis, I argue that this rate of output has the potential to produce burnout in the listener. This is done through the process of what the philosopher Zizek calls interpassivity, which is the process in which, again, another quote, humans transfer responsibility for an outcome from themselves to a more abstract agent. And so I argue that by releasing at such a relentless rate, by endlessly putting out such material, musicians are transferring the roles of responsibility of their art to two abstract agents. In one corner, the consuming audience, and to another, the algorithm of Spotify and such. To the first corner, these acts are asking their audience, people like you and me, to construct a coherent understanding of the music rather than try and produce something like that themselves through constraint and editing themselves. If one thinks about the concept of meaning in art, there's long been a discussion around who controls the meaning, i.e., who decides what it means. It is widely accepted by now or it's accepted by a lot of people by now that once the art has gone public, the meaning is for the audience to decide. This piece speaks to me about blah, blah, blah. So if you're the artist, why not release everything and let the audience be the filter of your own quality? The problem with this sort of artistic interpassivity is that it puts those who want to embrace the music on a route to burnout. Take any of the named acts above. Can you play the Melvins track?
Yeah, sure. Well, here we go. Sorry about the abrupt end there.
That's all right. It's a pretty spot on, slightly heavier recording of I Get Around by the Beach Boys. Why would you bother? But to go back to the essay, in your first listen, all those acts that I've mentioned are pretty startling, and yet through the relentlessness of releasing music, it becomes so easy to ignore them. Their release rate becomes a conveyor belt of noise with no time to digest what they have actually produced. Rather than as one album, these things released as albums should be better listened to as a continuous thing. And surely they don't think everything they produce is good. I mean, take that Melvins track. What's the fucking point? Every time the Clash's, every album becomes the Clash's Sandinista, and rather than become a unique artistic statement, they just become noise. The relationship between the so-called underground and capitalism has always been a bit murky. But if the musician isn't left wing, opting for independent labels, if it is a choice, the scene as a whole is arguably marked by a selling direct to customer basis. Small group, small people selling to small people, and trying to be reasonable about the price. The idea of an absolute exploitation is attempted to be avoided in this model. As far as I understand, in the classic Marxist explanation of the capitalist mode of production, the worker is alienated from the product by selling their time and skills to the capitalist. The capitalist owns what the worker produces and the tools they do it with. Basically, the capitalist is buying the product of the worker through their time. And yet now, far from rejecting the capitalist model of production of the day, these alternative musicians are producing so much for consumption that they are the new capitalist model of artistic production showing itself. If you look at the relentlessness of what it means to be an online personality, it is the same thing. Your life becomes a commodity to sell. It is a process that creates an alienation of musician from the product themselves, and from the product from the audience. This relentless output, these pieces of music are no longer a dialogue between musicians and their audience, but musicians and an algorithm, the other one of Zizek's abstract agent. To bring back to Byung Chul Han, just because you can release everything, it doesn't mean you should. There's a reason why someone like Prince has such a vast catalogue of unreleased material in his archives, because even a genius like him understood that not everything he did was genius. On a personal front, my problem with it is exactly who has the fucking time to trawl through your shit if you don't. Make a lot of music and release what you think is the best and most interesting. Spend time getting it right. That's just my little bit of opinion, without academia, really. Maybe the point Maybe that's the point of the model, though, of following the model. Release as much as you can, because people don't make much money from records these days, and a lot of it comes from streaming. Thus, musicians are captured by the new payload of streaming. You can only become successful if you don't burn out before you've become successful. Messy ending, but there you go.
Wow, yeah, that's great. We'll publish that. Or can we publish that on the podcast page? Are you all right with that?
Oh yeah. I'll send
Okay.
you the script.
It's lovely. I mean, the reason I like talking to you about things like this is you often kind of shine a light on things in quite an objective way. I know obviously there was some opinions in there, but you're right. A lot of modern musicians do shit out a lot of stuff. I mean, I've done it. I've done it myself, but I come from a publish and be damned
Yeah.
kind of angle, which I used to. I don't now. Yeah,
I think to be fair to them, they may be doing this. I don't think this is necessarily like a conscious thing that people do. But I also, I just think at a certain level of publishing, who the fuck cares anymore?
right, let's look at it over time. So when the album became a thing, like properly became a thing, so early 60s, bands like the Beatles, it wasn't unusual. Well, the 60s right through to the mid 70s, it wasn't unusual for big bands like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, to have a couple of albums out each year.
Yeah.
And then that sort of changed in the 80s. And by the 90s, you had bands on quite a predictable routine of lead single, second single. Let's talk about new bands. So it would be lead single, second single, third single, album. And the album would only have a song on it from the third single. So by the time an album had come out, there was 3 what you might call lead tracks, and then you'd always get 3 tracks with the single. So that's 9 songs plus 3 lead songs. That's 11. Sorry, my maths is falling apart. And then at the end of the 90s, when arguably the record industry was making more money than it had ever made before, things went absolutely nuts. And you had even bands that are on independent labels releasing 2 versions of each of 3 or 4 singles off an album. So you had maybe 12 tracks on an album. I need you to top this up, Sam. 12 tracks on the album.
Get a calculator up.
With 2 EPs, 2 EP versions of each single. So that would be 8, 16, 24 songs. So you had 24 songs plus the 12 on the album. So each album cycle was 36 songs. So what happened at the time was you had a lot of bands would just end up punting out shite. There'd be remixes, live versions, lots and lots of things like that. So those bands, who you think if they released 3 or 4, bands like Blur, they released 3 or 4 albums in the 90s, more than that actually, it was 5 I think. they've got a back catalogue with hundreds of songs. And what
Yeah.
interests me is, as a side note, Suede are cool as fuck because they never did live versions, alternative takes, or remixes. They just wrote a lot of really good songs. But bands like Blur, when streaming services came along, they have a phenomenal amount of back catalogue to mop up listener airtime on things like Spotify.
Yeah.
But if you take those people off to one side, and you now get modern bands saying to a modern band, and the album cycle was like 2-3 years. You know, it would happen, and then the touring and whatever. Now, because you've got bands like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard just pouring out songs. How do you know where to start? I mean, it sounds like a really obvious thing. You get into a band. Can you imagine I'd never heard of the Melvins, saw them live, and thought, wow, I really like some of that stuff. I'm going to go into their streaming archive now and have a look. What is all this cack? What's this stuff with like Marine March chanting? And I wonder if it puts more people off bands than puts them onto them.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I can't get into. My friend Al is really into King is an Electric Wizard. I have this I'm just like nothing I've heard, and this has nothing to do with the band, the quality of music. But nothing has just taken me like that. And so you have this old idea of like the 10-second rule. You know, this 10-second rule of singles someone came up with. I can't remember. If it doesn't grab you within the first 10 seconds, throw it out. And this was like old A&R, like radio idea that you have to grab the audience within the first 10 seconds. And I just, it becomes more and, it becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. It's that whole Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame thing, and then you truncate it to 15 seconds of fame. And, you have that. People listen to so many playlists now put together by Spotify and what have you, and you have those seconds to sort of trap people. But also you have this other side of things, which is people listen to. We there's also a lot of people. I've read people saying that music is now more ubiquitous than it's ever been in human history because we don't have to look for it.
Mm.
I leave the house, you sit on the bus, you put headphones in. And it's, oh God, that's awful. Ambient sound, bad. When you're talking.
You sound fine. What's interesting is, we used to have to hunt for music, and plenty of people on podcasts have talked about finding music through zines and it being like a conquest, a challenge to actually find something, even if you did like it. But this sort of availability has not gone the way I expected it to. When Napster and the internet first came along, it was meant to be this democratization of opportunity, as was the punk scene in the late 70s, as was the garage scene in the 60s in America. It was meant to be, right now anyone can do this. But the problem with the playlists on Spotify, I wish those two things didn't have a similar name. The problem with them is that all they've done is introduce another generation of gatekeepers. So as a musician, I have released quite a lot of electronic music, which I'm probably going to take off Spotify, actually, which I don't think the Spotify executives will be crying about, and no one's listening to it anyway, so it's a bit of a who cares. But they've just, if you want to release music and you want to get somewhere on streaming services, you basically have two ways of doing it. You can pay an absolute fortune for online advertising and promote your singles or you promote videos on YouTube. And a lot of really big bands do that, and it is fairly accessible. And I've released stuff in bands, in my band Dystopian Sound Collective, and it would cost us maybe 20 or 30 quid to get 5,000 or 6,000 listens or views on YouTube. And then what you're hoping for is that when you've got your streaming links in the description, that people will go through and start following you. It didn't happen with us. It might have been because no one liked our band, and I'm fine with that. I've not really asked either way. I'm old enough to not really give a shit. Or you have to hire a PR company. Now, what these PR companies do, whereas a PR company in the past would have helped you organise a tour to promote an album, helped you get your press sheet together, helped you speak to record shops to sell physical product. What a lot of them now do is basically hound bloggers who create the playlists. So we're just back to where we were at the peak of the pomp of major labels in the 90s, where everyone has to kowtow to influencers and gatekeepers. I mean, we call them influencers now. They're just the same kind of gatekeepers that always existed. You know, the gatekeepers in the 60s in Britain would have been the DJs on Radio Caroline. And nothing's changed, Sam. Why hasn't it changed?
Well, it's interesting, you know, and that's that aspect of like, I think that point I made is that you get these bands like King Gizzard and Electric Wizard who release so much stuff relentlessly, and you know, I don't think it makes much more sense to listen to it continuously, because that's that thing of like Sandinista is got some of the best songs the Clash ever put out and some of the worst, but easily some of the worst. The proper Clash, not the cut the crap Clash. And Sandinista is like a really interesting artistic statement released in the released in 1980, maybe 1981. They didn't do another album. They didn't release another album for 2 years afterwards. But it's this idea that they put together these 6 sides of vinyl and released them. They did everything they recorded in that period of time was released, you know, as sort of coherent tracks. And it is, you know, and if you ever read up about Sandinista, there's all this stuff saying there is a genius album in there, but you have to trawl through quite a lot of crap to get there. It's my favorite Clash album. So it is partly because it is such a flawed thing in a weird way, because it has so many mistakes. Never listen to the last side of that piece of vinyl. Never listen. It's terrible.
I've not listened to much of it. Is that with all the school choirs and stuff?
Yeah, that was the keyboardist, the kids of the Ian Jury and the Blockheads keyboardist singing
really?
Career Opportunities, which just sound like that's an idea you have when you've had too many drugs. But you know, I think that sort of thing is like you can take it as an artistic statement, but I don't think these bands are making these artistic statements so much. I think they are pursuing rather this sort of model of algorithm chasing, and just hoping that's, you know, they put out enough and the audience will grow and it will get these bloggers on and so on and so forth. And, you know, every single one of those, apart from the Melvins, who did I name? I named the King Gizzard Electric Wizard, Death Grips, The
I'm going to look up their
Body.
name because I'm not sure exactly what their name is. So, sorry, carry on. King Gizzard.
And it is King Gizzard and the Electric Wizard.
No, it's the Lizard Wizard.
The Lizard Wizard. Oh, what the fuck?
Sorry, talking about elitist gatekeepers.
Yeah. You know, have a name. Have a name you can remember easily. And that's another aspect. That's another thing. Bad artwork, badly labeled artwork in avant-garde music scenes. Stop. Label your albums clearly, because people in record shops have to order that shit. You know, put them in alphabetical order and figure out who the fuck this artist is. So be clear with your album artwork. Sorry, that's a thing I got from spending a month in a record shop trying to order albums. Sorry, I'm rambling. But I guess the point is that who has the time to go through this stuff, and what is the purpose of all this material being put out in such a short amount of time? I don't think it also suggests to me that people don't spend as much time putting together these albums as they used to. Like, you know, I think that my idea of the first album was always a lot, and particularly in the punk scene stuff. It tended to be so good because you spent so long putting it together.
Well, like
And the
literally years
second,
writing it on the road
yeah,
and living in
and then the
squats and
second
whatever.
album comes along, and you have to do it in a truncated format, so you don't have that same process because you also have, if you're successful, you also have that like touring stuff going on as well. And if you're just putting out everything you do the first minute you do it, where's the time to create that complexity? And so something like The Body, who are very improvised in part, I think just sort of, again, just sort of goes, instead of writing detailed music, they improvise stuff. And in that, and one of the problems, I think this is another problem, and I'm mixing so many things up. And there's another problem with that improvised scene is that you start to dwell on cliches to get through those pieces of noise. So rather than, and this is an argument I'm happy to have with anybody who knows much better than me, but if you write music, if you put it together, you can put places in for improvisation, but you can layer the music in a way that is always and continuously interesting. Whereas if you are just to write the basic thing and then you just improvise over it, like the
There's a
Kirk
version of
Hammett's.
gone.
Sorry.
I was going to say there's a version of Marky Moon by Television that's got an extra layer of Tom Verlaine just improvising over it, and it's fucking terrible. It hurts.
But what
The album's lovely, but that version just no.
I guess what I'm arguing is that, like, if you don't take the time to do things, you don't get to be Queen.
I think there's two things driving this. First of all, A&R men used to be very much in control of bands and very much in control of their output, especially from if you're on a major label. Whereas now, because we're all releasing our own stuff, there is no A&R man being, to be fair, the voice of reason. And it happened with Pink Floyd towards the end of Pink Floyd or Dave Gilmour's solo stuff. There wasn't someone saying, "Do you know what? You might want to just leave that bit out." There's that, but the other thing is because it's now so cheap to record. Albums. The second Jesus and Mary Chain album, I think it's the second one. Is it Loveless? The second one cost £500,000 to make and nearly bankrupted the label. Now, I've on my computer that I'm talking to you, I've got Ableton, and I can and have recorded whole albums. I haven't been into a proper recording studio, for a few years now. Even with bands, I haven't, because we just don't need to.
But it's I think that's that point of, like, you made talking about earlier point you made. We bring back to that is that I think more and more acts used to have more editorial nuance going on in their lives and going on in their experiences, and you would have, like, that's the point of the producer. The point of the producer is to try and create the best version of what the band brings them. And if the producer is just saying everything is genius, what's the point in them? Sorry, I'm a bit under the weather, so my mind keeps wandering off.
Same here. I got a cold. That's why my voice is so low.
I'm probably going to sound even more bunged up than last time. But it's just, yeah, it's that thing of going of second thoughts. Is this good? Yes, then put it out. If you don't know what it sounds like anymore, and you the person who made it, then you probably shouldn't put it out.
I'm trying not to kind of keep bringing this round to stuff what I've done, but this is a large part of why my main band, These Are End Times, have only released 2 albums in we're about 15 years now, because we take 2 or 3 years to write a song, which sounds incredibly long time, but that's how long it takes us, and we dump a lot of stuff. We really do, because we know exactly what the aesthetic should be. and not much gets through that. And it makes it difficult. But to be honest, we've found that not being prolific has actually kind of helped us, because if we do a gig now, or if we do release something, people are actually interested rather than it being, oh, right, it's a Monday, there's a new track available.
I mean, that's an interesting thing, though. The process of, I remember being in the last band I played in. I won't mention their name, because this is the part of the band I didn't enjoy, and enjoyed most of the other aspects of it. But I remember one particular rehearsal someone saying, "Oh, that was a good riff, but it wasn't on brand." And I'm thinking, we're just four sweaty males in a shitty studio in
There's
London.
on brand and there's fitting the aesthetic. I think those two things are quite different. I mean, there's Doors tracks that have very silly bits of circus music in them, and that fits the aesthetic of the Doors, but doesn't fit the brand. The brand of the Doors is Jim Morrison being moody and whatever, but the circus music, it doesn't fit that. So did you find that a frustration then? So you found it limiting?
My favorite experience of being in a band was basically, we wrote what we liked at the time, and we tried to make uh, and you try and find your relationship between those instruments, and rather than being aware of any aesthetic aspect to it, it is that we're playing this and we're playing this. Uh, but that was due to, I think, the guitarist being really sort of honing in on like the individuality of the musicians in a weird
Mm.
way. Like, I was quite young when I was playing it, so I wanted to play every fucking note, because I wanted to be Rancid's Matt Freeman. So I wanted to play every fucking note on the bass in every on every track. And the guitarist wanted to do. He was sort of bringing in. I'd say he was sort of bringing in Stray Cats, sort of, but he was wrestling with the guitar more than playing it a lot of the time. And the drummer, this is the band Pist Resistance. Our album is on Bandcamp, pistresistance.bandcamp.com. And the drummer, he never really relaxed into the thing, so he just sort of charged ahead as loud as possible a lot of the time. And the complexity that me and Lawrence tried to put together, we sort of threw out a lot of it just to try and keep up with the drummer. And it's sort of, that was a frustrating but also sort of really exciting thing to be part of. But we were still trying to write basically sort of interesting songs behind it, what took our fancy, and then layer things over the top to make it more and more interesting, um, for repeated listens in a way, and for repeated plays.
I think it's an important part of it. Some of the bands I've been in, I've always had the thing about putting in things that are just for the people with headphones, and I think it does really help. We're about halfway through, so I'm going to flip here and go back to the original thing,
model.
the original thing of bands that you used to love but you don't listen to anymore. So you've had Rancid and the Melvins.
Yeah.
So I'm going to play you a track, and I've deliberately not chosen a track that you might know, and I'm not sure you'd know any tracks by this band, but I'm going to play you the track, and I'm going to explain that. I'm going to explain why I went off them. So here's the track. Any guesses at who the band is?
Oh, I like it, the sound of it. It sounds maybe early 90s, because they couldn't afford really expensive production. There's a Suede aspect
It's
to it.
1986, I think it is. So you're
96.
close.
Yeah.
This is
Who's
a
that?
band that were a large part of why I got into music and why I got into playing in bands. That was the Stone Roses.
What?
Yeah, that was the Stone Roses. Heart on a Stave. It's from an album that they recorded. Yeah, say mid '80s. They recorded for Rough Trade, and they recorded the album, and Rough Trade declined to put it out. So they did nothing. They didn't release anything for a few years, and then released an
That was
album.
like that was like almost Suede goes hardcore punk.
It was really goth. I mean, at the time, they were all black leather and that was sort of garage, really, sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
more like late
Bit of
'60s garage
Scythe.
music.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that album's good. It did get released. They released it to stop it getting bootlegged when they signed to Geffen in 1995. It's called Garage Flower, and it is pretty good. But I mean, the band, the Stone Roses, as a whole, I absolutely obsessed over them. I mean, like crazy obsessed. And they were gone for years and years and years through legal battles. And they came back with a second album. And I can remember putting it on, and me and my friends who were also obsessed were horrified because they came back sounding like Bon Jovi or something. And there are some good points to that. That album's called The Second Coming. The first album I still think is perfect, but I kind of can't bear to listen to it anymore because I listened to it so much when I was younger. And then Ian Brown turned out to be a complete bell end in many ways. And then they did the whole we're never gonna reunite, we're never gonna reunite, and then they reunited, made a phenomenal amount of money, and then buggered off again. And it's kind of a problem of mine that I struggle to separate the art from the artist a lot. I mean, sometimes with bands like Burzum, that's really easy to like just decide not to like them because they also sound terrible. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I guess another podcast is why do people worship early black metal when it sounds so shit?
God,
And
I don't get that at all, and I love black metal. Okay, so there's that one. So you've had Rancid, the Melvins. Do you want to just kind of summarize why you used to love them? I think you've pretty much covered why with
well,
Rancid why you
Rancid,
don't
yeah,
like.
because they became cliches or cliches. The Melvins because they stopped putting out stuff that was interesting. And there's an aspect where you could say if you were listening to the Melvins in the mid '90s, they were pretty much doing the same thing 10 years later. When I got into them in the mid 2000s, on with the album "Nude with Boots," I think it was, or was it Melvins? What was the album? Just get that one up. No, Senile Animal was the album I got into the
Oh
Melvins.
yeah.
Yeah, and and then I played that album to death. I love that album. It's still my favorite Melvins album. And there's an aspect, therefore, that's what would put me off this sort of thing of like a band like the Melvins, this sort of conversation. A band like the Melvins, I don't know if their quality has dipped that far. I think King Buzzo is probably he is a great songwriter, but there's an aspect where it all just sounds the same after a while. And this is a weird thing I think about some music to me. It's like the more when you first get into the music, into a scene, the more and more you listen to it, the more individual it becomes. You can understand the difference between, I don't know, the Sex Pistols and the Clash, whereas to someone standing outside that scene, that just sounds like abrasive noise. And you would say the same with like Sick of It All or Gorilla Biscuits. Any scene, someone standing outside it may not notice that there's a difference in what the band's playing. But there's a certain point where you start listening to so much of it seems to become sounding the same as well. Like there's a point,
This is the
some
thing that
sort of
we
curve.
discussed in the first episode. We both like bands that progress,
Yeah.
and so several of the bands. I mean, Stone Roses did progress massively. You didn't know that was the Stone Roses, and I think most
No.
people, even if they couldn't name a song, would recognize the aesthetic when they hear it. Right, let's move on to the next one. So this next band you probably will know, and I'm gonna here we go. Here's the clip. Just remember, listeners, we only get 30 seconds, so we don't violate any licensing things here. So go on, name it.
Anti-Flag. That was the album. That's the only album I know of theirs that that's the one I like. That album.
Yeah, well, same here actually. I looked it up and I was like, yeah, bands I never listened to, and I heard that and I was like, that's really fucking cool. I really like that. I don't think that's aged badly. I don't listen to the albums after that. My friend Ricky, who I used to run a record shop with, summed it up really well. He said, they've just become one of those political bands that goes down to a drum going dum, dum, and the singer going, you got to stand up and you got it, and which they totally did. But
the thing is that to me, they always sounded like a more rigid Rancid because they have that busy bass playing, but that busy bass playing is much more predictable than what Matt Freeman's doing and much less intricate in its rhythms. Matt Freeman tries to be quite playful in his rhythms, I think. And the drummer is a lot tighter. And actually the Rancid drummer is sort of appealingly sloppy.
Well, so is the singing. That's the other thing with Rancid. I know Armstrong's vocals
the
are
singing. I have to say, I mean, it was bad, 20 years ago, but it's so over the top in its sort of like performance of I can't even pronounce. Yeah. But yeah, I know what you mean about Anti-Flag. But I've tried to listen to them, and it's the same thing. And there's a weird thing where I think they do change, and I think they change to a point where they roll off a bit of the challenge musically, at least, and become much. I don't know. It's like trying to appeal to younger kids. And I'm not a young man.
I think that they're a good gateway band. I think if you want to actually start in their place in my head is if you want to actually start thinking about the world, if you actually want to start challenging your preconceptions about society and whatever, Anti-Flag's a pretty good place to start. Just the questions they ask, and they don't solve the questions. And I always think that's a mistake. People think political bands have to solve the problems.
But that's why I always loved at least Jello Biafra. Jello Biafra I could have put Jello Biafra in this because I don't understand what he's doing in the Guantanamo School of Medicine. It's just like a mid-paced, unimaginative Dead Kennedys. But the Dead Kennedys is one of the greatest things, and one of the sort of the greatest collection of sardonic lyrics you could ever put together. And when you're 14 and you hear "Let's lynch the landlord" and you've never really been exposed to that sort of politics before, you go, "What the fuck does that mean?" And
it connects. I was in London a few days ago. I was on Tower Hill just because I like wandering around London sometimes. And there was a Japanese kid. Well, I assume they're a Japanese family. A bit of an assumption on my part. Very, very smartly dressed family. And the kid had like ripped jeans, leather jacket, and he had this massive patch that said "Curse the patriarchy" with a picture of a pentagram. And I was like, that kid must fucking love music like Anti-Flag. That's probably what made me think of it, actually, because I also looked at him and I thought, that's cool. Well done, mate. That's just badass. Cool. While his family was taking him on a trip around the world or whatever. But right, we got a hammer on here. So this next choice is yours. Here we go.
No, you.
Oh, did you want me to stop?
Yeah, I can't be bothered with the body.
I really liked that.
But I was going to say one of my favourite things. Actually, this is a track. This has nothing to do with the theme of it, but the JPEG Mafia, the one that you struggled with getting right cues for. Play that one. That'll be my last one.
That one. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Stop scaring the hoes. Play that shit out and touch their toes. We don't wanna hear that real shit no more. What the fuck is that? Give me that Mars code. this shit. You wanna be an MC? What the fuck you think it's that 93?
Welcome to that big league. This is young man sport. Fuck that hip hop and that old man flow. What an auto-tune that. Give a fuck about the trash. Cause all up in the scams. Catch up on man. Say ain't about
Whoa! I mean, I'm surprised you want me to clip it there because it then drops. It then goes into probably what you'd expect it to. Actually,
I asked you to do that because actually the lyrics are the most clear there, if you can call them clear. I like them. You know, I'm not a big fan of because of sort of the politics. My politics. I'm not the biggest fan of some of the use of the words. Really, but I really liked the sort of knowing sense of humor of like, how the fuck are we supposed to make money off this shit? And I love the fact that the saxophone or whatever noise it is just sort of goes. It's really funny. Going, what do you mean?
That's
you mean
so
this
cool.
is difficult to listen to?
It's interesting. I've talked to you recently off air about the Chuck D hip hop documentary at the BBC. I don't think they made it. You know, I imagine it was a co-production with the BBC and whoever. But there's an interesting part in that where they it's really, really good for one thing. It's very, very much about civil rights, and they address head on the misogyny, sexism, violence of 90s hip hop in a way that I was really surprised by, because it's not often actually discussed. It's either ignored or apologized for. No one actually discussed, so it's worth watching just for that. But Eminem in that, he is asked, what do you think about some of the use of language or some of the claims that are made in the flow, you know, when in the rap? And he says, if you believe it, you're fucking stupid. And I thought, okay, that will require you to know that it's a parody or know that it's being stupid. So this is a massive discussion for another time, but I can totally see why someone would listen to like black metal. Well, not that you can tell what the lyrics are most of the time, and go, what? They're doing what now to the what? And I thought, well, actually, it's probably not that dissimilar, is it? But there's still growing up in Britain as a cisgender white middle class kid. I still blanch a bit. I struggle with some hip hop, and I mean hip hop that I really love.
That's an interesting. I mean, I'd be into talking about this longer. But that's a really interesting thing. My favorite, I like early death metal, and one of my favorite albums and bands of that early death metal is Cannibal Corpse, and Chris Barnes, the original vocalist, because we shouldn't call them singers. They're not really singers, they're vocalists.
Texture providers.
Texture providers is such a piece of shit.
Oh, really?
And his lyrics are misogynistic to a fault on those albums. And there's a whole sort of, and it has been acknowledged in some quarters how misogynistic, particularly this sort of gore metal world has been, you know, sort of. I mean, one of the songs is called "Entrails Ripped from a Virgin's Cunt."
But I just assume that's just being stupid. You know, it's just.
Well, there's an aspect of like, yeah. That's the other aspect of like, you can't hear any of that shit. Literally, the man just seems to be burping into the microphone sometimes.
I can remember years ago, someone here in Ipswich, the kind of the big grindcore bands, I think a lot of people in metal have heard of, is Extreme Noise Terror. And I can remember many, many years ago, a friend who was really into them, who was a roadie. And he said, of course, they're not played on the radio because the lyrics are too political. And I can remember thinking, how would anyone tell? I was thinking it's probably far more. I know the guys in the band, so hopefully they're not going to hate me for this. But I think it's probably far more because at the time Mariah Carey was on the A-list on Radio 1, and Oasis were in their pomp. I think that's probably why Extreme Noise Terror weren't played on Radio 1 and weren't on top of the pops.
I once played, I think one of their late 90s albums, now ex-girlfriend of mine had pissed me off, and I just put it on, and she wasn't used to sort of that extreme noise, and I thought it was the greatest thing I've ever heard, and she was not very pleased with me. But I was very happy by the reaction. You know,
You said to me before that metal had to be angry for you to like it.
I think yeah, I can see myself saying that. I think it depends, though, not all the time, but I think there's got to be some small child element of playing aggressive music that comes through. If you do it too seriously, I don't. I went to see. I know I'm never sure because they might be really straight faced, but I went to see one of the biggest disappointments. I hate seeing bands up live sometimes because I want to see Arbrot or Arabrot. I
Oh,
can't.
yeah.
Norwegian band hyped up by, I think, some English blog or other. I can't remember which one. And I just thought it was so fucking pretentious because it was either really funny or just really pretentious with no ability to sort of know
It was
itself.
nice when you and I went to Tuska last year,
Yeah.
and we saw Insomnium, who I really like. I really rate their new album. I might do an episode just reviewing it. And you said you weren't sure if they took it seriously before you went, but Insomnium live, they're just having a blast. They're grinning ear to ear. They're mucking around. They're not like a parody band. They're just really enjoying themselves, and so's the audience.
And I think for me, that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of punk shows are so much more fun, frankly, is because you can see people having fun.
Mm.
They're not scared of having a good time. And they're not based. And I've seen other metal bands where they base their good time on being like this really fucking puerile human. I just hate that shit. Like, go on stage and make dick jokes. Oh, fucking really? And weed jokes. Oh, fucking.
There's a complete doubt. There's a lot of bands in the 90s that were just like, even at the time, I was thinking, what are you doing? But anyway, got to have to go in a minute.
Yeah. What's your last track?
My last track, it's going to be another one that I thought I used to obsess about this band, and I haven't listened to it for ages. Then I put it on, and I've got a prepared comment, which I'm then going to completely rescind. So here's the last track.
Drink, sex, cigarettes, Ford Cortina, household pets, bombs, wars, famine, death, and apathetic public couldn't get left. Public watches ITV, reads the sun, drinks cups of tea, a two-star families take content, and life's controlled by Parliament. Well, Gully's lost his job again, because he never had no brain.
So it's Subhumans with Apathy. And I put it on, and I was going to say that I love this band. And I saw them in Ipswich because this Subhumans are the sort of band you can still see in pubs. And I drove away really buzzing with it. And a friend of mine, who's a bandmate of mine, he said, that's the problem with some political punk. It's just, I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like this. I don't like that. And I just went, shit, he's right. But having listened to that again, I really enjoyed it. Much like Anti-Flag, I'm going to revisit Subhumans. I thought that was fucking great. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
oh,
that
also,
was great.
Dick was snotty to me when I spoke to him once, which is really unfair of me. The singer was like, I said, "Is it? I've heard a rumor you're going to write a book." And he's a very clever man. I do like him. Well, I don't know him, but I like a lot of what he stands for. And he said, "Oh, it's true." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, it's true. It's a rumor." And I just thought, oh, you didn't need to be that kind of snotty with me. You could have just been nice, but he's probably been asked a lot, and that was a split second. He could have had a cold, and I'm not going to judge him based on one thing. And I am going to go back and get my Subhuman CDs out and probably stand in my house shouting about things I don't like.
You know what? That was the nice thing. I haven't listened to that Rancid 2000 album in years, and I found a reason to put it on, and I still fucking love that album too.
Well, it's been a brilliant contrivance for an episode, and I really enjoyed your essay at the front there, and a really good discussion, I think, on perhaps musicians probably ought not to be quite so prolific, but we're out of time, and I would happily chat on for ages. But Sam, have you got any closing remarks?
Let's do another one and just put it out as quick as possible.
well, this is going to go live in the next few hours. It's 29th of March 2023. So whenever you're listening to this, just know it came out hot. Do I mean hot?
Steaming.
Right, you can have the final words. I'm going to say goodbye. See you later, everyone. Go on, Sam. You have the final words.
Good night and goodbye.
It's more polite than last time. Oh, sorry. No, you've got to say something else now because I accidentally had the last words.
No.